Good morning, everyone. We're going to kick off today's Finance, Revenue, and Bonding, Transportation Bonding Subcommittee meeting. We have agency presentations from DOT this morning. There's a decent echo in here that I'm not sure. Perfect. Thank you. My Senate co-chair will be joining us shortly. He'll be joining via Zoom. I see Senator Fazio online, and I'm joined here in the room by Representative Carney. So the leadership team is excited for this component of it. We have members joining us from across the state. This subcommittee essentially is literally where the rubber meets the road. In the Transportation Committee, we often talk about the policies underlining transportation in Connecticut. It kind of frames where the investments should be made and how they should be made. But the reality is we come to this subcommittee to determine how we're going to generate revenue to pay for those projects, to highlight those projects, to prioritize those projects, and ultimately advance the long and short-term capital programs for the state of Connecticut. This is always an exciting time to get updates from our commissioner about the status of projects that many of us have seen as we traverse the state, but also to get a window into what we see upcoming. There are only a few changes from last year's approved bonding program that are referenced in this submission to us today. I know there are some priorities that legislators have as well that we'll seek to consider. But with that, I'll turn it over to my House ranking member, Representative Carney.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for being here today and all of your staff. I always appreciate hearing from you and all of the things the Department of Transportation has plans for. Transportation is obviously something that can be, really change things in the state, whether it's the economy, certainly the environment. And I always appreciate your thoughtfulness on these presentations and everything you want to do to balance safety and commuting and things like that to really make Connecticut a better state when it comes to that. So I'm very excited to see what you've got today, and that's it. So thanks.
Thank you. And I see Senator Fazio online. Senator Fazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Looking forward to the presentation from the Department of Transportation today. I appreciate their work and look forward to our continued conversations on the subcommittee about how to improve transportation in the state in a fiscally responsible manner. So thank you for the time.
Thank you. And with that, Commissioner, we're going to turn it over to you. We're all very excited to hear about projects that have taken place, but also the challenges that you're likely facing as a result of inflation, labor shortages, but also opportunities as part of Build Back bill. So we're excited to hear from you today. And with that, Commissioner, we turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. So we have a short slide deck walking through just briefly what the two changes proposed in the governor's budget are, as well as an update on our capital program to date, hopefully saving most of the time for questions. So on the first slide, you'll see our first change, which is focused on, or here are the two changes. One is $100 million in Fix It First Bridge, which is one of our standard bonding line items. This request is specifically due to a bridge paint failure that we saw across the entire state on many of our older bridges where paint flaked off. And we'll talk more about that. And the other is just 1.5 million additional funding in our environmental compliance program to support our compliance with an EPA consent order on stormwater cleanup of our stormwater system. So if you go to the next slide, bridge paint in about a little over a year ago, when we had some significant freeze and thaws with very warm temperatures and then a huge sudden drop in temperatures, we had a couple hundred bridges lose paint all at once. It essentially popped off. This was lead-based paint, so paint chips ended up on the ground across our state, or had loose paint still hanging off of it. So we declared an emergency declaration within our statutory power at DOT to mobilize contractors to begin to do the cleanup on the ground due to the potential for human life impact there. We have identified 220 bridges that need to be metallized and cleaned up or repainted. And so this is the first of a multi-year long process that we're going to be seeking funding from the legislature to do this. So it's going to be probably over $800 million total to do all the bridges we need to do. And this is the first year we're seeking this funding. Next slide. Certain bridges were all across the state. Cromwell, East Hartford, Farmington, Hartford, New Britain, Plainfield, West Hartford. So as I mentioned, it's going to take 8 years to cover all 220 bridges. We did coordinate with the DEP, EPA, and Department of Public Health because we wanted to ensure that none of them were in drinking water territory, and they were not. But some paint did end up in some of our rivers, so we had contractors working to clean up paint flakes in those rivers as well. Next slide. So the other is called TS4, Transportation Separate Storm Sewer Systems. This is a consent order that we entered into with the EPA to do more cleaning of our storm water basins all across the state. This is something that municipalities also are required to comply with on their side. We have around 120,000 storm water basins that need to be serviced or cleaned. We don't have the staffing or equipment to do this. So this funding is to bring on additional contractors to support our efforts to comply with that EPA consent order. Slide. So those are the two changes. I'll go quickly into an update on our capital program, and then we'll open up for questions on those changes and everything else you have. So next slide. As you can see there, we pulled together a chart showing what we've identified as expenditures between 2014 and 2023, broken down by mode between highway, bridge, and public transportation. And then estimated or dollars that are in our capital plan from 2024 through 2028. The huge spike in 2024 is federal grants that we received for our Northeast Corridor railroad grant that we received from the federal government. So that's why there's a large spike that year in public transportation. But you can see a clear trend of increased funding for our transportation infrastructure in Connecticut. Next slide. Here is a chart showing value of advertised projects. So these are the projects that we, looking backwards, did go out and advertise in that federal fiscal year. Again, a clear trend upwards. And looking into FY 2025, we're looking at even larger increase in total value of advertised projects that will go out to seek bidders on. Next slide. And then this shows capital expenditures. So taking out the total value of the project, this is looking at how much money was actually spent, paid out for construction only. And so you see, starting in 2022, we've had a large tick upwards of actual work being and construction being done out on our roads, bridges, and public transportation system. Next. So one of the key components for us is discretionary grants from the federal government. So if you go to the next slide, we have a summary of some of those to date that we've received under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Under IIJA, there's a total of $100 billion in competitive discretionary grants available to compete for over the 5-year period of that bill. In the time that that bill has passed to today, CONDOT alone has received almost $1.5 billion. And there's still about 2.5 more years of competition to go in those programs. So we are well ahead of where we thought we would be in terms of discretionary grants. We expected to target for our state in total around 1% of total grants. We are way beyond that at this point, which is great for Connecticut. Some of those listed on the slide, you can see the Gold Star Bridge was one of the largest bridge grants in the nation for $158 million. We have money for new rail stations or upgraded rail stations on the Waterbury branch line. a new bus rapid transit system in New Haven, a bus garage in Norwich for the seat, Southeast Area Transportation, as well as smaller grants, but just as impactful to begin the process of planning for the Greater Hartford Mobility Program, which is 84 and 91, as well as a major bridge in Stamford, and efforts to modernize our public transportation's fare box system. Next slide. Amtrak also had some grants as well, $826 million for the Connecticut River Bridge in Old Saybrook, and $4 million for a study from New Haven to Providence. Next slide. And you see here, these are the big grants we received for our railroad system. So when you take our grants, around $1.2 billion that we received from the Federal Railroad Administration last year, plus the $800 million that Amtrak received, that means $2 billion for Connecticut just from the Federal Railroad Administration. The big chunk there is the Walk Bridge in Norwalk. After this grant and all the other grants we received from the federal government for the Walk Bridge, we've taken basically at least around 80% of the cost of the Walk Bridge, which is $1 billion project, off the backs of Connecticut taxpayers, and have the federal government and Amtrak picking up the rest. Other major projects are seeing substantial funding. Devon Bridge, which is our longest rail bridge, that is going to be a multi-billion-dollar project. The federal government not only gave us $245 million, but made a commitment that if we can keep it on track on time, that we will receive up to additional $2 billion from them for that project. And then they just are releasing a new notice of funding opportunity for additional funds for the railroad this year. So we plan to compete for as much of that as we can get. Next slide. And so another component is local programs. If you go on to the next slide, one thing I will point out, so of all the grants I've talked about so far, the competitive discretionary grants from the federal government, I didn't list all the grants that are going to directly to a council of government or a municipality. They also have eligibility to compete, and they have received quite a lot of funding for their projects. So Connecticut is doing very well on the competitive discretionary grant side. But we also administer several 100% state-funded programs that the legislature is providing funding for us to administer. A few of those are listed here on the screen: Community Connectivity Grant Program, Local Transportation Capital Improvement Program, State Local Bridge Program, and the Transportation Rural Improvement Program, which is our newest one. So these are intended to provide direct state funding to local governments, avoid the federal red tape, which comes along with any federal aid funded project. Next slide shows how much has been administered to date. So under Community Connectivity Grant Program, the legislature has authorized close to $70 million in that program to date. Bond commissions allocated around $55 million of that, and we plan to be requesting the next 15 in the coming months. Under Lot SIP, that's over $700 million. 561 million of that has been allocated to date. And that program is administered through the councils of governments. They come to us, they select the projects, they come to us, and they request funding from us when they're ready to make payments out. So it's a rolling program there. Similar to State Local Bridge Program, $159 million to date. 120 million has been allocated, 38.7 million still authorized but unallocated. Again, it's a similar program where municipalities, as we need funding for their projects, we come back to the bond commission for those projects. And the newest program is TRIP, the rural program. $10 million was authorized last year. And we awarded all of that this just about a month and a half ago. So these programs are really oversubscribed. There's a lot of interest at the local level for these programs. And we're really excited to see these projects be delivered. And I think that is it. So wanted to save as much time for questions as possible.
Thank you, and appreciate that. As members may notice in front of you, And for those who are online, in your email inbox is a great analysis provided to us, largely by Patrick Mellon and OFA, and it's greatly appreciated on our end. Your willingness to communicate with our team here in the legislature to make sure we understand fully where these projects are, the status of them, what the priorities are for FY25, decompressing those long-term and short-term capital improvement programs into a digestible format is of a great benefit to all of us on the committee as we understand broadly how we intend to utilize the capital funds are going this year. Gary, thank you so much for your work and communicating with our team to make sure that our team has all of that information. We know where we're going. And again, at the mile high level, thank you for your work in securing the magnitude of federal dollars through the discretionary grant programs, but also your efforts working with our allies in DC to ensure that the types of priorities that we have in Connecticut are reflected in those bills and they're accounted for in the construction of a lot of those programs. It's not an accident that we're performing above our weight and securing a lot of these federal grants. It comes down to the time, the team that you have securing them, but also helping to write a lot of the programmatic rules of those programs. And so it's deeply appreciated, the role that you play beyond our borders in securing additional funds for us here in the state. I want to first touch on a few global issues. Staffing shortages at the Department of Transportation, how that impacts our capacity levels to take on new projects, to complete projects, and the timeline by which you have to rethink certain projects because of that. And I know you've been before this committee for a few years now about your challenges in getting staff into Department of Transportation. I know we reformed some processes legislatively, but you internally have engaged in that as well. So I'd love to get an update on the status of staffing internal to the agency and how that impacts long-term project delivery.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is an issue for us that I've spent a lot of time trying to address. We are doing a lot better than we were a year ago or 2 years ago after we had a large number of retirements. We are focusing on our two main bureaus. One is Highway Operations and Maintenance. Those are our crews that go out, not just doing snow duty that most people see them doing, but also fixing the guide rail, fixing potholes, cleaning up litter, as well as picking up dead animals on the side of the road. They are the backbone of our agency. And so we are down to only a 7% vacancy rate in our Highway Operations and Maintenance Bureau, which is fantastic. There was a time there where we were worried we would not be able to even perform our basic snow functions. The other side of the house is our Engineering Construction Bureau, our other largest bureau. About a year and a half ago, or 2 years ago, we were at a 24% vacancy rate there. We're down to around 15% vacancy rate, so we've made a lot of progress. Hiring, recruiting takes a lot of time and effort on the part of our supervisors and managers, who are the ones that are reviewing all the applicants, conducting the interviews, completing the interview selection reports. And so it is a very long process from start to finish to hire in state government. But we are trying to shave time off on either end of the process, make it more efficient internally, try and do things sequentially or concurrently so they don't have to be done sequentially. So to save even a week or two can make a difference if someone has a potential other job offer. The biggest thing has been the lack of engineering students graduating from our colleges and universities. We've had a lot of discussions with leadership of those colleges and universities. Our chief engineer, who was here, Scott Hill, and our assistant chief engineer have been talking with leadership as well, talking about what their curriculum is, how we can make changes to their curriculum to make the students better prepared to enter the workforce, but also what can we do to grow their programs, get more students coming in as civil engineering students, because what we've seen is engineering in general has increased total graduates, but they're not graduating with a civil engineering degree. They're focusing on other aspects of engineering. So we're working closely with UConn, CCSU, the State College University System, but also the private universities. So we've been in discussions with Quinnipiac, Sacred Heart, University of Bridgeport, University of New Haven. Everyone is recognizing this is a crisis, and it's not just Connecticut, it's a national problem. So in terms of our capital program, the impact there, we are continuing to deliver an expanded program, much larger than we've ever seen before. If we were fully staffed, we probably could expedite projects a little bit faster out of design into construction. But it's not for lack of trying to fill those positions. So we're going to continue to prioritize that. And that's our engineering leadership team continues to prioritize that and make sure that we're not burning our staff out either. We don't want to result in staff leaving to go to the private sector or another state DOT because this is a national problem. This is an extremely competitive job market for engineers, and we need to do everything we can to keep them at CONDOT and show that we're the employer of choice and that you should want to work with us at the DOT because one, it's a great place, it's a great family, it's a great place to work. But two, you're going to be working on the most consequential infrastructure projects our state will probably have ever seen in our lifetime. Not since the creation of the interstate highway system will we have done things as impactful as we're doing right now.
And I think that's good to put that into perspective about the magnitude of the program itself and how it's grown over the last few years, the opportunities that we have moving forward. I know you confront not just labor shortages internally, but also externally, whether or not there's a private marketplace with skilled laborers who are able to do these projects. I'll often hear frustrations that we're not putting enough money in the field right now. And like we have this capacity and it's going underutilized. And I know you confront some internal challenges with product inflation versus supply chain shortages versus labor cost increases. Can you kind of give us a window into how you're prioritizing projects that confront those escalators and whether or not that compromises the capacity to do some projects, or what determines whether or not you move more quickly or less quickly on a specific project that might be identified and actually in some ways identified for project funding, but we don't want to move forward as quickly as the timeline people would feel comfortable with.
So right now, we have not reached a point where a project is being held up due to lack of funding. We have the funding availability to move all of our projects that we've identified that are in design or completed design. Where we are seeing some issues on the economic side is on cost of projects. Their costs are coming in a little bit higher. I'll bring Scott Hill, our chief engineer, up to talk a little bit about that factor. As he's coming up, I can add that we are seeing in some cases fewer bids coming in on projects than we used to see on average, especially in lower Fairfield County, where we are seeing many fewer bids for some of our large projects. And actually the winning bidder on several of those large projects are from a company from out of state, which is doing fantastic work, which has traditionally not done work in Connecticut. And it was because we had a lack of Connecticut companies bidding there. And what we've heard from those Connecticut construction companies is to get their staff down to lower Fairfield County to do overnight work on the highways is just it's a big hurdle for their workforce today to do because they can't afford to live down there. So the construction crews and the construction industry, the workers who are on the roads doing the work every day can't afford to live where those projects are. And generally they're living in other parts of the state, and to ask them to make the trip all the way to lower Fairfield County in rush hour to be able to stage and get ready to start work as soon as rush hour ends. They just can't get enough crews to want to do that every single night. But I'll turn it to Scott to talk about other inflationary projects.
So I think the commissioner did a pretty good job summarizing. Sorry, Scott Hill, chief engineer. So we, as the commissioner indicated, we did have a situation where we were getting, bids that were 20% higher than normal. We saw a lot of inflationary issues, a lot of shortage of supplies, certain materials, a lot of issues with microchips that fit into everything that we do in construction. And so some of the technology we couldn't get delivered, but a lot of that is supply chain issues and delivery. And, we've slowly gotten over that. What we're seeing now, like the last couple bids we've gotten have been much more competitive. And our estimates are more in line with what we think the cost of the project would be. So we're feeling pretty good about the fact that we're starting to see a little bit of settling in the economy and the shortage of supply chains and delivery. But in Fairfield County, there was a lot of work going on in New York. And so some of the Connecticut companies were doing a lot of work in New York, and some of those contracts are starting to close out. So we think we will start to see more competition in Southern Connecticut. But right now, Yonkers is pretty much outbidding everybody, and they're using the workforce from New York City, and they're bringing them up to backstop the projects in that area. So in the other parts of Connecticut, we're seeing multiple bids, 4, 5, 6 bids. Really nothing wrong in those areas. A lot of competition and a lot of contractors interested in work. In some areas, we have a shortage of contractors, and specifically in some of the traffic signal issues and some of the areas where we don't have a robust bench of contractors bidding for jobs. And so we keep a close eye on that. But traffic components against are, technology driven and today. And so again, shortage of components and shortage of supply in those areas is continuing to have a effect on some of our contracts. And long delay, you could have a utility issue too as well, where the utility can't get the parts, and so that can delay a project and cause us to kick it out. And little things like oil tanks, they're hard to get. Gas tanks, some of those jobs we'll bid them out, and then we'll actually have to wait a year for the delivery of the tank because of the back order and all those. So as we shift to a U.S. purchase economy where we're having more and more of our people made in the USA, we're monitoring it right now. Connecticut doesn't have a problem with it. We're getting enough supplies. We're not having any shortages, but we are keeping a close look on it, make sure it doesn't become a problem.
To some specific projects, highlighting first the major change incumbent in the presentation is the $100 million addition to the Fix It First Bridge program. You outlined a long-term project here. Is $100 million sufficient to cover the entirety of the program, or is that the first tranche of dollars necessary on an ongoing effort to repair those bridges?
So that is the first of an 8-year request we're going to be making to the legislature. But I'll let Scott talk about how we broke that up for you.
So when we had the problem, and it was basically a cold air night and then a very warm day, and what happened was the steel expanded, and the paint, which is lead-based paint, had dried out over the years, and the flexibility of the paint would not expand at the same rate as the steel was expanding. And so we literally had paint exploding off of the bridges all over the place. And what we did after we got, and Connecticut was hit the worst. I mean, of all the New England states, we had the most change in temperature. We did have a substantial back inventory of old painted bridges. And there was a period of time where DOT Connecticut was not painting bridges. We were focused on getting our poor bridges to fair. And, so we had this whole strategy to get out of the bottom and get Connecticut at the top as far as condition of bridges. And we didn't go and attack those bridges and the paints on those bridges. And so when this occurred, we had a lot of bridges that had a problem. What we did is we developed a program. We said, listen, if we're going to spend the money like this to paint the bridge, it's not cheap. We're going to focus on 25 bridges that have 25 years or more life left. And so we came up with 220 bridges that we felt that had enough life left in them that it was worth investing the money to paint them. And it ends up being about $800 million. And then we said, well, that's a lot of money. And how can we fit that within our program? And, what's a reasonable pace to do these in? And, how many contractors in the market are interested in doing this? And we were surprised there's a lot more interest in doing the painting than we expected from the market. And so we came up with somewhere between 16 and 28 projects a year we could do. And it kind of averages out to about $100 million a year for that period of 8 years. And that would get us through the 220 bridges and have all of our bridges that had this happen to them painted and in good state of good repair. I will say there's another 250 bridges that need to be painted as well that have had paint deterioration over the years. And we are trying to take care of those as well as part of our regular program.
Sounds like in addition to an engineering program at UConn, maybe we need a bridge painting program at UConn. $800 million is a lot of bridges. It's an expansive project here that I can't say I ever envisioned prior conversations with you guys. So I appreciate the recognition of the severity of the issue, sadly coming all to fruition at once and putting us in this position. It does represent a substantial increase in the Fix It First Bridge program. I'm sure there's going to be questions about that from members as well. I've got a number of other questions, as you might imagine, about specific programs that I'd love to clarify, but I do know I have questions from ranking members and members as well. So I'm going to turn it over to first Representative Carney.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your presentation. I don't have too many questions overall regarding some of the things you were discussing. I think they're pretty much answered in the last round of questions. Was some of the things that I was going to be asking. I guess one thing, I guess overall, I mean, are you concerned at all about? I know if a few years ago the Special Transportation Fund was in the red. Are you concerned at all, going forward, that we're going to end up in that similar type of a situation again, and funding will be a problem?
Yes, we will be in that position in the future. The General Assembly and the current governor and the previous governor have taken steps to prop up the transportation fund, largely by, a new revenue stream passed a few years ago, but also largely shifting general fund dollars into the transportation fund. Today, I think that is now the plurality. That's the single largest source of revenue for the transportation system is general fund sales tax dollars. So we have diversified the special transportation fund more so than other states have. Other states are facing a much more imminent crisis with their transportation fund because it's still directly tied to gas and diesel taxes largely. And so as we see more fuel efficient vehicles continuing to come through as a result of CAFE standards, as we see electric vehicles come onto the market, the transportation fund will need to address, and probably, I think, in the most recent budget is, I believe, starting in 28 is when we'll start to see it dip below the line. If the treasurer's office and the governor's recommendations are adopted to do a surplus cap in the STF, that will extend the solvency of the STF until 28. If that's not done, it'll probably be 27 is when they start to dip below the line. So not just Connecticut, but the entire nation is going to need to address how do we pay for transportation moving forward. And most other states are now testing and piloting other measures of how to do that. And so I think we will need to have that discussion in the next few years for sure.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. So another thing, I'm curious about is, related to, snow removal or inclement weather, things like that. And I mean, this past year, the snow, I can't, probably 5 times it snowed. I mean, significant snow, not even that probably. So I'm just wondering how you can go about planning for that. I do see some, plow trucks and things like that and capital projects related to that. So, I mean, what are some of the things that go into planning for that? I mean, are you going to do what you've always done? Or are you taking into consideration, that it snowed less over the last few years, things like that?
Yeah, so in terms of equipment, we're going to focus on we've moved into a cyclical replacement program for our equipment. So instead of buying something, and our head of maintenance likes to call what used to be cradle to dumpster approach, where we'd pay top dollar for the equipment, keep it as long as we could, and then throw it away. Now we've moved to thanks to the support of the legislature and the governors, we've moved to a cyclical replacement program where we buy equipment that is a little bit more, has a higher resale value. So instead of custom painted orange trucks, we move to white trucks and we have stickers on them instead of paint. And that way, when we, after 5 to 8 years, when we go to sell it on the resale market, we're getting a very high dollar return rate for that. And that then gets reinvested back into our equipment pool. And so it's really made a difference for our crews out there who are doing the job. They are much happier now about the equipment that they're riding in and they're using to do their jobs. So on the equipment side, we are pivoting a little bit to do a dedicated fleet of snowplow trucks, but then some smaller vehicles. So we don't have to take those plow trucks out to do the day-to-day job on the side of the road. And that's more cost effective for us in terms of fuel and the environment. But the other side is on the operational cost in our appropriations budget. So I'll let Gary talk about the big driver there is salt. He can talk about how we're adjusting our salt purchases for the next year.
So Gary Pescosolito, the Bureau Chief of Finance and Administration for DOT. Starting last year, we did have an issue with the salt because we worked with DAS contracting in order to supply our salt sheds for the year. We have minimum requirements to purchase in order to get the contracting rates. So, we approached those a little differently this year. We reduced the minimums earlier last year to ensure that we weren't going to have excess salt that we did kind of like last year. We preserved all that without having to pay out penalties and minimums. And we're able to get through this year almost perfectly with full salt sheds at the end of the year now going into next year, which is great, without having to, hit a much higher level of a minimum, which ended up, saving us a couple of $1 million in OE, about $3 million. That obviously is, reprogrammed within OE for shortfalls that we always have in OE that probably would require us to have a little smaller FAC action coming later the year. So we do address it annually, looking at what those minimums are in the contract to ensure that we're not over purchasing or over committing to those purchases to make sure we're sharp.
And the only other piece I'll add is the other cost driver in winter operations is personnel costs, overtime costs. And so while we had less overtime costs during winter, what we have seen the past couple of years is we're doing a lot more call outs of our crews on weekends and at nights, one for crash coordination and coverage to shut down roads, but two for spring and summer storms and fall storms. So water events are becoming much more common, and we're having to call crews out to shut down roads and do emergency repairs to roads due to water instead of snow work. So that's the personal services, the overtime costs are generally where we need them to be. While we saw a reduction on the winter overtime costs, we've seen an increase on the other types of weather events and crash events.
Okay. All right. I appreciate that answer. I mean, I really, appreciate all of the fiscal responsibility you've been taking with the vehicles and with the paint change and all of that. It sounds fantastic. So I really appreciate that change. So I guess my last question really is regarding, and this is probably more, certainly more district specific to me, but is with the Amtrak managed projects. So the Connecticut River Bridge replacement and then the study. So I guess I'm wondering how much will DOT be involved in those programs, and what type of an input can DOT make? If there's things that, say, people in Connecticut don't necessarily approve of in Amtrak's plans.
So with respect to the Connecticut on the Connecticut River Bridge project, we are a partial funding partner. So the Federal Railroad Administration grants required either Amtrak has to pay for a part of our projects or we pay for a part of theirs because Shoreline East goes over that railroad bridge. So they are consulting with us. We're at the table with them, but they have really sole decision-making authority on the design and what advances, other than they have to go through the permitting process through EPA, through the Army Corps of Engineers, through the Coast Guard, and through DEEP. But we are coordinating with them very closely on all of that and the new alignment for that bridge. On the study piece, that's driven by Amtrak and the Federal Railroad Administration, but both Connecticut DOT and Rhode Island DOT are going to be parties to the study. They have not officially started the consultation process yet. They've started doing the data gathering phase internally to themselves, and then they are going to include us at the table to be consulted during that process of the study.
Okay. All right. I appreciate that. And these are two things that are obviously, pretty important to me. So I'll be monitoring myself as well. So thank you again for your answers to my questions and for your testimony today.
Thank you. Senator Cohen, my chair from the Transportation Committee side of things. Good to see you this morning. Senator Cohen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. And thank you for being here, Commissioner. Grateful to have you presenting to us this morning. I wondered if you could go through, you didn't touch on the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. I wonder if you could touch on that a little bit, where we're at with that. As a department, I know there was a plan in place. There's maps that have been provided, and I'm wondering where we are in installation and in dollars as well, if you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. So the federal government provided us with a little under $53 million over a 5-year period for NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. We issued an RFP for the first round of funds to close the gaps in our alternative fuel corridors, which are 95, 395, 91, 84, and Route 7. And so that RFP closed. We received applications. We're in the process of reviewing the applications. They're essentially grant applications where we would provide funds to the private sector to build out, operate, and maintain these electric vehicle charging stations on these roadways or off these roadways. And so we hope to make awards in the next 3 months or so, once we conduct the full vetting of all the proposals. Once those are selected and completed, then we'll be able to go out and do a second round of RFP to fill gaps in the rest of the state off of those corridors. So that's where we'll focus our attention for the next round, is doing consultation with communities, with councils of governments and nonprofit groups, the legislature, to see where else do we need to focus to fill gaps in fast charging across Connecticut. But that won't be until much later this year or early next year we do that next RFP.
Okay, so when do we expect this first round? We'll start to see actual charging infrastructure going in as a result of this first round of funding?
I can't really say until we review what the actual applications are. I imagine it won't be until next calendar year because to do the electrical upgrades on site, there's going to need to be electrical upgrades on any location that is selected. So that's going to require coordination with the utilities on the part of the private party. And to get the parts for the installation there is going to take some time.
Okay, I appreciate that. Can you give an update also on the wrong way driving program, the technology there? I know at last count, you were up to about 22 exit ramps. I know that there was 20 million allocated for FY25. I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, and the cost of installation of these and where the department's at.
Sure. So I think we are definitely over 20 ramps right now. We should be, I think by the end of this month, closer to 40 is my belief. With the funding that's been provided to us by the legislature, we will be able to complete almost every single identified high-risk ramp in our initial screening. They can be expensive depending on the location, if there's power needs there. So if it's a ramp where there is no electric installation today, we will have to run utilities to that location. So that is sometimes the delay, but what we've been able to do is do some work in advance on site during winter to be able to prepare for the installation once the weather has changed. So the price can range from a couple $100,000 per location up to closer to $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 per location. We also have to pay for like a subscription fee for the service of the technology to send the images back, the recordings back to DOT and the state police, which basically is paying for a cellular or a fiber drop at that location to service those.
Okay, appreciate that. And we've obviously seen them already work, so that's the good news. And I appreciate how speedy the process has been thus far, and hopefully we can get the remaining locations installed expeditiously. Just two more questions with the indulgence of the chair, if I might, on rail freight infrastructure. Just can you talk a little bit about that program? I know we had authorized $10 million in GO bonds. Anything going on with that?
Yeah, so we did do our solicitation there and issue awards. It is a very important program. Our freight rail system is a critical component of our economy. They do provide a fantastic service to carry a lot of goods at a much lower cost and a much less impact on our roadways, whether it's impact due to heavy vehicles on our roadways or congestion caused by trucking. So we continue to support any investments in our freight system. Some of our freight system is owned by the state of Connecticut and leased to private operators, or it's privately owned rail beds owned and operated by other companies. So we do think it's a critical program to continue to advance. Our rail team is working with the awardees to work on issuing those grant agreements so that they can do those investments that we've awarded.
So is that the full $10 million that's been awarded?
Yes.
Okay. And lastly, just on community connectivity, I know we increased the authorization for this fiscal year. Do you know about how many projects are being turned down in terms of applications and the dollar amount that's not being awarded? If you could speak to that at all.
I don't want to guess, but there
Okay.
was a large number. So I can get that to the committee after.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know if we're turning projects down because they're just not viable community connectivity programs, or because we just simply, this is just a competitive grant, we simply don't have the dollars. I'm sure it's a little bit of both in some cases. So if you could give us that breakdown, I think that would be really helpful. It'd be nice to know how much, if we were to fully authorize every application, what that would look like.
Yeah, there were definitely some that were not ready to be funded for sure
Yeah.
in screening, but there were others that were very viable candidates that we didn't have the resources to fund in this round. So we encourage them to look to apply in a future round, but we'll get you the full breakdown.
Appreciate that. Thanks again, Commissioner, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. It looks like it's Representative Baumgartner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and great to see you, Commissioner, and your team. A question regarding the Northeast Corridor Modernization Match Program. I know myself and many of my colleagues, including several that serve on the subcommittee, have been very outspoken regarding the need to restore funding to historical levels for shoreline east, but also think long-term about how we can utilize that rail line to, I think, unleash unprecedented economic growth in southeastern Connecticut. As you know, seeing that growth in large part because of expansion at Electric Boat and the employment base there, but also tourism, certainly in Mystic and the many surrounding areas, as well as Norwich because of the casinos. And so my question to you is kind of now that the Eastern Connecticut transit feasibility study is completed, where kind of the desire to build new infill train stations and have new shoreline east stations along the current Northeast Corridor along the shoreline, where that fits in this larger comprehensive plan that is being largely led by the federal government.
Yep. So currently, so that's all Amtrak owned territory, and the Northeast Corridor Commission does not have any additional stations or expansion from east of New Haven in any of their plans. They released a document called NEC 2037, which is looking out through 2037. What are all the project needs that we have as a region from Washington, D.C. to Boston? What do we want to achieve? Amtrak has identified nothing east of New Haven that they are looking to build out. So it's not federally eligible for any of those planning or federal funding opportunities. They also have identified on the Hartford line, which is Amtrak owned, but state of Connecticut invested. We do have some projects identified, such as realignment of the Hartford line. I think the big piece for southeastern Connecticut is the New Haven to Providence capacity study. So Amtrak and the Federal Railroad Administration are hyper focused on how do we improve travel time through Connecticut, because Connecticut is the slowest portion of the Northeast Corridor. It's the weakest link, if you will, for rail travel in northeastern United States. And largely it's because of when you get east of New Haven, it is very curvy, and that is not good for a railroad if you want to have higher speeds. So that is their focus, is conducting the study to figure out how can they make improvements to improve speeds east of New Haven. Getting to Providence is where they're really hyper-focused right now.
Excellent. I know most of those curves and crossings, at grade crossings, are in my district. So I just viewing it from the map, you can see, really in that specific area, how difficult it is to have, true high-speed rail in that area. But nonetheless, thank you for that answer. And lastly, the TAP grant, I think it's the Transportation Alternatives Plan. It's the grant that is made available to municipalities for bike ped improvements, basically non-motorized transit. Is that reflected in this capital budget? And if so, where specifically?
It's not, that's a federally funded program. So that would appear in our capital plan,
Okay.
not in our bond authorizations. So it's a federal funded program that we act as a pass-through to local governments, working with the council of governments. So local governments will provide projects to the council of governments, who then work to screen projects, come to us with those projects, and then we will, with the total funding pot available for that federal fiscal year or those 2 federal fiscal years, we'll identify, okay, Southeast COG identified these as our 2 top priorities. This is the sub-allocation level that we are authorized to give, because in the total pot of money, the federal TAP funds that we get, it's the federal government says this much has to go to this part of the state, this much has to go to this part of the state based on population. So that's how it shuffles out. And so it's not represented in our capital plan because it's a federal project.
Excellent. And just looking at the culvert replacements, one last thing, is how much coordination is done with DEEP in particular? I know many of those culverts, migrating fish and other wildlife, is there coordination to ensure that there's fish passage also is either restored or made better after that new culvert is put in place?
Scott, do you want to do it? Or so everything that is touching a water course will have to go through permitting through DEEP. And sometimes Fish and Wildlife Service, sometimes other agencies, but I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, we just started 30 years ago, opening back up the fish passages and putting in critter ladders and things to let the wildlife get through the culvert. It's very regulated, and we have regular meetings with the fisheries over there, and we're very close and personal relationships with them. That's how much time we spend together working on this stuff. They screen every project. They come in and they look at they go out into the field, they look at it, whether we're reopening a passage or we're going to make it, put in the fish ladders so the fish can get up, and more territory can be opened up. So they have maps where they know where the fish are and what's causing them not to be able to migrate where they need to. And, we're a willing partner to fix them and to put them in the correct way. Yeah, we're really working close together.
Well, thank you for your answer. I know our fish friends may not be able to send an email or, be able to articulate for themselves up here, but, nonetheless, appreciate your answer on that. And again, thank you for punching above your weight, getting our unfair share of federal funds. The Gold Star Bridge project has been just really well done. So thank you again for your leadership, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I think that brings me back to me getting a second bite at the apple here. A few things, kind of a follow-up to a number of questions that have been asked so far. By far from legislators, what I hear, the success of the TRIP program and whether or not that needs expansion, those dollars are quickly utilized We recognize that there is certainly greater demand than the bonding allocation was able to accommodate last year. So I think there's pressure from legislators to like examine that program to see if it could, if you could get more projects up to the field with additional dollars. So I presume you're not going to argue with additional dollars, but like, what is the capacity internally to expand that program based upon the successes of this year?
So, we are beginning to reach a capacity level internally in terms of staffing, administering a lot of these new grant programs. We expanded community connectivity. We stood up TRIP. So our team, we also created a new Safe Routes to School program. So that's all under the same team essentially. And so they're reaching the point at which they're having difficulty keeping up with administration of a lot of these local grants. And it's twofold. One, a lot of the grants we have administered are slow to get off the ground, or grants we've awarded are slow to get off the ground. So they're having to keep a handle on a lot of the old grants and a lot of the new grants. I think in TRIP, there were there were more applications than awards made. Some of them were not, some of them that were left on the table were not ready for funding for sure. Others were viable candidates. So it is one of those programs where if funding was to be increased, I think there would be projects statewide that would definitely benefit. We're seeing things pop up as emergencies that had not been anticipated, whether it's bridge washouts in Scotland, that no one ever had on their radar. Whether it's a road, an embankment for a road being washed out in heavy rains. This is becoming much more common. So I think that's an area that local governments, especially small rural local governments, don't have funding available to address their emergency needs. So I think that's a discussion I think we probably should start having, is do we do more discretionary grants, or do we have some form of like emergency fund pot to assist a local if there's an infrastructure emergency, which is becoming more common because the storm intensity is much greater than anything we were ever designed for.
Yeah, and I think I've heard about that bridge in Scotland from 2 different senators, and so that's I think really impactful bridge it must be. I don't think I've ever traversed it. So, similar to a question that Senator Cohen touched on earlier with respect to the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Act. There's 3 pieces of legislation / executive orders that sort of determine a little bit of planning. I think that I know that you've, as an agency, have taken to heart in how you plan for and scope out projects, but I think it's worth exploration here. One is the executive order 21-3 requiring DOT to establish a 2030 vehicle miles traveled reduction. There's SB4, which we passed alongside the Environment Committee in 2021, which essentially tries to establish a carbon budget for large transportation projects. And just this past year, at the end of 2023, FHWA issued a final regulation requiring DOTs to set declining targets for reducing CO2 emissions associated with transportation. Like taking those 3 actions together, sort of both legislatively directed, the governor directed, and now federally directed. How does the agency approach those sorts of restrictions and or obligations when thinking through projects for the next 50 years? And like, has that changed your approach or how you prioritize projects internal to the long-term cap program?
Yeah, so I don't want to speak for Scott, but one thing that he has done since taking over as chief engineer is work towards incorporating a lot of those specific directives, policies. So in the engineering construction realm, the way we operate in the transportation space across state DOTs is directives come down from usually the chief engineer that are called controlling design criteria, really indicating if you're going to do a project in our state program, this is what has to be included, has to meet these standards, these type of features have to be included. So last year he issued a controlling design criteria dictating that every project moving forward from that point on has to have accommodations for pedestrians, for cyclists, as well as for transit, if transit's in the area. And so it goes beyond just having a complete streets policy, but then he directed it be included in every project. So from that point forward, every project is going to have sidewalks, bike lanes of some form, whether it's just a buffered bike lane or whether it's a protected bike lane or a side path or something, as well as accommodations for transit users. Similarly, he stood up a new ADA unit within engineering construction to focus on all of the curb ramps across the state to ensure they're all ADA compliant. So those are the things behind the scenes that we've been doing to not only allow people to choose how they get around in the future in our projects and programs, but also ensure that it's accessible to everyone, no matter what your mobility impairment may be. Also, it goes into what our requests are on the public transportation side, what we're thinking about doing. A lot of the projects and programs we're looking at on the horizon, like the bus rapid transit system, are intended to provide an alternative. The microtransit program we just launched, again, provide an alternative, maybe reduce the number of cars a household has to have, reduce the economic burden while providing freedom of mobility. And then we ourselves are focused on building out solar on our properties, reducing our carbon footprint through electric vehicle expansion in our pooled fleet. We also are pursuing a lot of our maintenance workers who are working on the side of the road. We have crash trucks that are there to protect them. In order for those crash trucks to operate, they usually are having to idle to keep all the equipment on, the lighting packages on to protect them. We're pursuing funds to go and pursue battery packs that can go on and run just on the battery pack, keep all lighting and safety packages running for, I think, over 15 hours if we need them to. So it's a rechargeable battery. So that way they don't have to idle anymore. So those are the types of things we're doing now. The next step is we're kicking off the process of the federal mandated long-range transportation plan, which we do every 5 years or so. And that now will take all of these new policies and directives from the legislature and the governor, incorporate that into the planning for our long-range plan, which then sets out for us the next 40 years. What does our state want to do for for our transportation system? Involves extensive public outreach and engagement. It's going to be a multi-year process to develop that. And then the last thing I'll say is, focusing through that long-range planning process, but also looking at our greenhouse gas performance measures, working with our partners. We don't know what the federal government's going to do with that type of greenhouse gas performance measure, whether it's going to stand the test of courts, but we're committed to continuing to advance that no matter what. Because we know that transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, so we have to do our part and potentially be the single largest solution to that.
Terrific. Thank you. And again, following up on another question Senator Cohen asked with respect to the rail freight infrastructure program. Again, I've heard that it might make more sense for us to move that over to an STO bond allocation. Might be a little bit easier to administer, to go out and move that program a little bit more quickly if it was STO administered program. So that's something that we're internally thinking through. We're thinking through an expansion of that program as well. So take your guidance on that issue when it's forthcoming. And I think it'd be important for us to reference all of these conversations we have about a capital program and what we need to go out to bond for in this coming year. Doesn't happen in isolation. We have to be focused again on the operations of those assets and whether or not there's a plentiful STF fund that can ensure that these investments are well made and well taken care of for generations to come. I'm thrilled to see the expansions we've made in public transportation, particularly over the last decade. Those things are compromised if we don't have a flush STF fund. The investments that we are seeking to make on either the Move New Haven or the Greater Hartford Mobility Program, the Eastern Connecticut feasibility study, which I recognized a number of opportunities for us to make capital outlays to move public transportation forward in the eastern part of our state. Like if we can't operate it, it's all for naught. And so I appreciate the role that your agency has played and continues to play in helping us think through creative ways to secure additional financing opportunities to make not just the investments that we've always enjoyed success in securing, but also the operation of those assets. So anything that your agency thinks of and thinks through, please let us know. Again, as the subcommittee responsible for helping fund the capital side of investments, we need to make sure it's operated in accordance with best practices and procedures, and we know it takes dollars to do that. So it's not lost on us that it's only one part of the puzzle to make the investment and another to operate it. So thank you for that. And I just want to say again, this is the second year of the 2-year authorization, so very little that has changed. But I think it's important to recognize the incredible talent and team that you've been able to develop at the agency. Scott could triple his salary probably in 15 minutes if he ever decided to leave. And that's true of a number of folks that you've managed to bring into the agency in the last year, but also to elevate internally to make sure that we've got incredible team and talent at every level. So I thank you for your efforts. I thank you for your passion and commitment to the state of Connecticut. And that can be said for almost every member of your team who's been with you and been with this agency and been working on behalf of the state of Connecticut for so long. It is deeply appreciated. And I just say thank you again for that time we've done that. As chair of this committee and chair of the transportation committee, I get an opportunity to go across the country talking to different leaders, and time and time again, they highlight programs and projects that the state of Connecticut is doing that we should, as a legislature, take credit for funding. But generally, they point to you and the team that you have in Connecticut for spearheading that. They recognize the talent that we have and the incredible sort of benefit that we have by having someone like you or Commissioner Giletti before you building out the team for the next generation. So thank you again for making Connecticut look good, for spearheading on a number of issues. And I think this committee stands in great appreciation for that.
Thank you. I will say, DOT is made up of over 3,200 fantastic, dedicated individuals who care greatly about the state of Connecticut and about the communities in which they live. We have over 60 facilities across the state in which they're working out of. But you're right. I will say none of what we do is possible without the legislature's support and the governor's support. The $1.2 billion we received from the Federal Railroad Administration, they told us it was largely because of the fact that we got so much of that pot of money because the legislature and the governor, before even we applied for the grant, acted preemptively to put aside a set of money in the NEC modernization authorization that we were able to point to and say the state of Connecticut is ready to put up our money and go for these funds. And that was really the driving force, the collective bipartisan support in the state of Connecticut for infrastructure has pushed us over the edge there. So thank you for your support there.
Of course, and we may occasionally disagree over some projects in the legislature, but generally it's always been a bipartisan support for increased investment across the board, whether it be public transportation, highways, roadways, bridges. It's been a shared focus for every member of this legislature, despite some occasional hiccups over project priorities. With that, and seeing no other questions, Representative, do you have any? Yes. Seeing none, thank you so much, Commissioner, for your time today. We stand adjourned.